Well, thanks very much for coming. This is completely false advertising. This is by far the largest audience I've spoken before, and certainly the largest during the daytime. So if we dim the lights, maybe you can all sort of relax. I have no visuals to distress your optic nerve, so you can really be a very calm afternoon. So it's really, I can't tell you how excited I am to be here because this is one of my, I don't know, third or fourth visit to a school, and I really am very anxious that the book be read in schools and by students as well as by other people who may or may not claim to be educated, but who want to be. But I'm particularly interested to be here because I think that the whole program of human ecology that the College of the Atlantic talks about and tries to teach is really essential to the project that I just finished, which is this book. And the reason is that my understanding, and it's very, very nebulous. I mean, I got it off of some literature that Darren gave my sister, who's a high school advisor and counselor, and she very kindly emailed it to me. And it looked a lot like the entry in Wikipedia, which, of course, made me immediately suspect. But since this is what you think you're doing, I think it's okay to go with. And that is this interaction, the human's interaction with social, natural, and technological environments. And this is what maritime history is. And it is what maritime history is, and what makes maritime history so distinctive from other branches of history or other ways of approaching history. Because when you talk about history the way most people talk about it, the sea is just sort of a backdrop. And so people in Britain will do some planning in England, and then they will, in London, and they will trot off to the sea, to the coast, to a port, to a ship, and they'll get on the ship, and then voila, they're in the colonies, either North America or the Caribbean or Australia or India. And there's no sense of the environment that they have to pass through, the environments that what they have reaped to create their ships have come from, no sense of the environments from which the goods they have harvested or made have come from. There's no sense of that, that sort of underlying structure of human life. But when you talk about maritime history, you absolutely have to address the environment, because everything that maritime history does touches on the creation of the technology that makes it possible to go to sea, and it talks about the structures and organization of the communities that make it possible to go to sea and that actually exist on the ships, which are very often quite different from the societies that we create on land. And then there's just the natural environment of the sea itself, the currents, the tides, the winds, the shallows, the deeps. And so today, I want to talk a little bit about how people, over the course of the last 50,000 years of going to sea, how people have addressed each of these different interactions. One, the natural environment. Following from that, I think the technological environment. And then third, the evolution of the social environment of the ship and the maritime communities of the world. Now, 50,000 years ago is the benchmark that I use for talking about maritime history, because that's when people first got to Australia. And we know from archaeological and other evidence that people had to get to Australia by water, because Australia, and what was then called Greater Australia, or Sahul, was a connected landmass that included Tasmania in the south and New Guinea in the north, but was not connected to Sundaland, which was basically Southeast Asia and Indonesia, but without all the water in Indonesia. Basically, Southeast Asia's peninsula went almost all the way to New Guinea, but stopped short. And so there was a water barrier between Sahul and Sundaland. And so people, to get to Australia, needed to cross that water. And how they did it, we don't really know. Whether they fashioned logs, whether it was completely intentional, which it must probably have been, or whether it was some sort of strange accident, which is possible but not very likely. But in any event, that's 50,000 years ago. The next big sort of development in maritime events and the sort of coping with the natural world was going between islands or any sort of landmass. And the two things that you need or the one thing you really need if you're going to go out to sail someplace is you have to know where you're going. And that's very easy if I'm going from here to that doorway, I can see the doorway. But if I'm going to the doorway down the hall from that doorway at the top of the stairs, I have no idea that there's anything out there. And if that doorway isn't there, all I know is that if I get to that point, I can see both where I'm standing now and where I want to go eventually. And that point is called a point of intervisibility. And so the big achievement that people made in, again, this very strange part of the world around New Guinea, which has sort of fostered all of this maritime enterprise at a very, very early stage. You know, what's his name? Not Neil Diamond, but the other Diamond. Jared Diamond. Doesn't sing as well, but I know somebody who danced with him at a wedding. You know, he talks about New Guinea and sort of looks at it as this sort of, he sort of couches it as this primitive place that hasn't developed the way the rest of the world has. But if you look at the maritime record, this is where everything started. It's really kind of fascinating. So the big event, 29,000 years ago, was people going from islands north of, from New Guinea to the north of New Guinea to sail to land completely out of sight of the mainland. So, and they did this through passage of intervisibility. They went from one island and they sailed out, and then they got to a point where they could see the next island and they could see the island they had come from. And then about 13,000 years ago, also in the same part of the world, we know that they got to Manus Island in the Admiralties north of New Guinea, which is completely out of sight. There is no point of intervisibility. It's just a straight shot into the unknown. And we know that they got there because of obsidian traces and all sorts of sort of artifacts that have showed up that could have only come from one place or another and been brought there by boat, by intention. So this was one of the first things that people had to do, is master a way of getting around the sea and the confidence, mastering the confidence to go out from shore with the idea that they could get back. And the way to do that was to know that there was a place to go to and know that there was a place to come back to. So the other thing that people had to do was figure out the winds. And the winds are a bit tricky. You know, they're fickle. They don't always blow the direction you want to. But if you pay enough attention, you come to realize that winds have seasons, and they have the probability of the wind blowing from a certain direction is often quite high. And so in New England, we have sou'westers because the wind comes from the southwest. And we know bad wind comes from the northeast. We also have sea breezes and shore breezes, which alternate between day and night, depending on whether the wind is, whether the earth is relatively hot in relation to the water or vice versa. That gives us a picture, if you will, of the biggest seasonal and sort of onshore, offshore wind system, which is the monsoon system of the Indian Ocean and the China Seas. And that's to say, a wind system that predominates across all of the waters of the land, from basically Tanzania, just across from the sort of northern part of Mozambique, all the way to basically southern China. All of those lands are, all of those waters are dominated by the monsoons. And the monsoon basically just means, it's an Arabic word, comes from the Arabic word meaning season. And so in the, when the Asian landmass is hotter, hot air rises and it draws the cooler water off the Indian Ocean to give you the southwest monsoon. And then in the winter, the land cools and you get the warmer water over the Indian Ocean drawing wind to the southeast or southwest, which is the northeast monsoon. And this is the wind system that people of the Indian Ocean used and pioneered for millennia. It's often said that there was a Greek guy named Hippolus in the, I don't know, 3rd or 2nd century BC, and he's often said to be the person who discovered the monsoon system, which is complete nonsense. He wasn't even the first Greek to describe the monsoon system. But this was obviously something that was known to mariners on the Indian Ocean, in India, in southwest Asia, in the Arabian Peninsula, on the coasts of Africa, on the coasts of Indonesia and in China for millennia. And it was that system that opened up the first major oceanic voyaging from Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea to a lesser extent, to the coasts of India, and then across the Bay of Bengal from India to the Strait of Malacca, and then on up across Southeast Asia and into China. And Japan and Korea and China have their own sort of relationship, which is not as dependent because the monsoon sort of dribbles out up in that part of Northeast Asia. So that's one type of environment that they really had, that people had to master. Similarly, on the Mediterranean, which is another ancient area or arena of maritime expansion and enterprise, they figured out that the currents work in a certain counterclockwise rotation around the sea, actually creating two separate bays, separated essentially by Italy and Sicily. And the winds also alternate seasonally. So there was a lot of north-south and east-west navigation, which dictated how people not only got around, but how they thought about the people who they encountered. And so there's actually, in ancient Egyptian literature, there's talk about people who come from the west. And they weren't actually people who came from the west. That happened to be the direction they seemed to be coming from when they got to Egypt, because they'd come down to the coast of North Africa and then skittered in along the coast, following the currents and the winds. But in fact, they came basically from due north. But they had to follow the environmental constraints. And so this sort of misinterpretation baffled historians for a long time until they kind of pieced together this environmental question. How did people relate to the environment they were in, and how did they interpret what they saw? The other major wind system, which becomes much more important in the 16th, 17th centuries and the classic age of sail, are the trade systems. And the trade winds are not called trade winds because they carry the trade. Any wind carries the trade, hopefully in the direction you want it to go in, sometimes not. But trade just means, it's an archaic usage of word meaning steadily or steadfastly. And so for a wind to blow trade just means it's a regular wind. And those winds were responsible for getting people, the Iberians initially, across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and North America, and eventually, once they crossed the equator, to the South America. And then again, in the Pacific, they were responsible for getting people across the Pacific, below and above the equator, and also in the southern Indian Ocean. You have trade winds there that sort of whip all the way around the world, which is why frequently ships that we were going from, say, Europe to China would go down the coast of Africa and then zip along, following the trade winds that blow below South America and Australia and Africa. So these differences in geography also had a lot to do, or had a huge impact on the way people built ships. Because you can build a boat and make it do pretty much what you want it to do, but you really want to have a boat that's suited to the environment that you happen to live in and happen to sail around. And in Europe and in China, both, we get very, very clear examples of different approaches to navigate, to shipbuilding based entirely on the coastal environment. So in the north, in Europe, the Rhine is essentially the dividing line between an area where north of the Rhine you have a part of northwest Europe that's essentially lots of moving and shifting sandbanks along the North Sea. This is obvious in the Netherlands, the Jutland Peninsula of Denmark, the coast in between of Germany. Very, very sort of temperamental areas, very shallow. And very tidal. So the Germans and the Dutch and the Danes in about the 13th, 14th century, when they started becoming a little bit more vigorous long-distance shippers, started building boats that were very box-like, and which made them more capacious and able to carry more cargo. But they also had flat bottoms with slightly turned up bows and sterns. And the reason was because when they were sitting around at anchor in this shallow, sandy, and muddy foreshore, the tide would go out, and the boat would be just sitting there on the bottom. And so you don't want a boat with a sharp tine because you sort of collapse. So they built these boats with very flat bottoms so that when the tide went out, you were still standing up, and when the tide came back up, and you had these little upturns fore and aft, the suction wouldn't keep the boat from rising. So in China, the Yangtze River serves basically the same kind of dividing line function that the Rhine does. And so north of the Yangtze River, you had lots of sandbanks and shallows that go up around the Shandong Peninsula. And so you have these flat-bottom boats called, I believe, Shachuan, and they were called sand ships, which were designed to be sailed around sandy areas. And in both south of the Rhine and south of the Yangtze, you had ships with much sharper hulls, which were much more accustomed to sailing into deeply embayed areas, both on the sort of rocky and embayed coasts of China and the rocky and embayed coasts of France and Spain and Portugal. Again, navigation also was affected by the geography of the places people lived in. And so in the early modern period, when European navigation really began to take off and accelerate in ways that it didn't in other parts of the world for a good while after that, you find that the approaches to navigation are very distinct in the Mediterranean and in the North Sea. Because in the Mediterranean, the water is so deep that taking soundings and trying to figure out where you are based on how deep the water is completely pointless, because you could sit there all afternoon just letting out your twine, waiting for the bottom to hit, and nothing would happen. So they relied much more on compass and distance, compass points and distance, in sort of compiling directions about how to sail and where to sail. In Northern Europe, however, on the Atlantic coast and North Sea, there's much more attention given to the soundings and the bottom. And so people would do the soundings because the waters are generally fairly shallow, but within a range that makes it possible to decide that you're in one place rather than the other. And they also devised a way to attach wax or tallow to the bottom of the sounding lead, and they would drop it down, and then depending on what stuck, they would know roughly what the bottom was like. And after enough experience of doing this, they knew that there was gravel over here, and shells over here, and mud over here, and gravel over in this other part, and maybe over here just like nothing would come up because it was just solid rock. But these were how people sort of began to map in their own minds and in songs and poetry and writing how the world looked, this invisible world that they had to deal with in ways that they didn't have to deal with things like that on land, because the environment is basically everything in maritime history. So the other thing that's less related to geography per se, but has some bearing on, geography has some bearing on it, and it's also one of the catalysts for going to sea, I think, is the fisheries. And I don't want to get into the whole, we are all drawn to the sea because that's how we got our brains bigger and all the rest of it. I'm really talking more about the basics of actually going fishing, and not what the sort of root causes of that are. Although I do acknowledge that fishing is important. But fisheries are very unevenly distributed around the world. The most abundant ones tend to be in cold water areas. And that's forbidding for two reasons. One, you could wind up living in a place like Maine, which is, it's great. But don't tell that to the people who went to Pemaquid in 1607 at the same time the Jamestown settlers went to Virginia. Jamestown settlers said, great, we'll die of the plague and mosquitoes, malaria and dysentery and everything else. That's fine, it's warm. The people in Pemaquid said, Jesus, never again. This winter was awful, we're going home. And that's what they did. And you can read it. It says, like, if there's another winter like this, forget it. We're just not going to do this. We don't actually have it so bad. Two of the most abundant fisheries in the world are off South America and off of Southwest Africa. And the reason they're so abundant is because they've got this huge troughs of cold water coming up from the Antarctic that are just breeding grounds for huge, huge quantities of fish. But because the water is very cold, the adjacent land, because there's no moisture for the air to sort of pick up and dump on the adjacent shore, the adjacent shores are desert. So the most abundant fisheries in the world just sort of sat there being abundant and the fish doing all their fishy little things, and nobody really could get at them until the 20th century because nobody could live close enough to the fisheries to really exploit them. And it wasn't until you got factory fish and clever marketers saying that Chilean sea bass is a really beautiful sounding fish, even though it's hideous and a trash fish. It wasn't until then that you could really exploit these things. So again, we see this sort of encounter with geography and place. But the fisheries are also important for another reason, particularly in Europe and particularly with relation to Maine and New England and the United States. And that has to do with the abundance of fish the one-time abundance of fish in Northern Europe, which really was a catalyst for a lot of communities in Germany and the Netherlands who, figured out how to catch herring and then figured out how to pickle it and to preserve it. And then there were all sorts of laws that said you had to eat fish on Fridays and on holy days. And so basically about half the year people had to eat fish, and the Germans and the Danes and the Dutch were only too happy to supply it. But occasionally the herrings would collapse, and then there were people who didn't actually like herring, God forbid. But there was cod. But cod is a more problematic thing because you need very dry air to preserve it, and it's complicated, and also it tends to sort of, you overfish it. And if you overfish it, what do? You follow where the cod are. And so people generally followed the cod across the North Atlantic. And they knew about cod off the coasts of Iceland because the Vikings had been there from the 800s or 900s. And then they sort of followed them on to Greenland, and they followed them off to the banks off of Newfoundland, and then they were all lined up in the Gulf of Maine. And all of a sudden, in the early 1500s, there are ships from all sorts of different places, from the Iberian Peninsula to Iceland to England to Germany, the Netherlands, France, all hanging out in Newfoundland and the Gulf of Maine, fishing here. Because although it's not a great place to be in the winter in the 16th or 17th century, it's a great place to fish. And so that's what they did. And they figured out how to dry it and cure it, and then they sent it back. And it was the fisheries that really were the catalyst for Northern European expansion into North America. So much for the natural environment. Now, I think, talk a little bit about the technology and how technology has, how people have dealt with the technology, have dealt with the natural resources that they have to create the technology that makes it possible to go to sea. Now, one of the fascinating things that I find about maritime history is that people will figure out almost any way possible to go to sea. There's really nothing that will prevent people who actually want to go on the water from doing it. And so we don't know, as I said, what kind of vessel or vehicle people had to get to Australia 50,000 years ago, or even 29,000 years ago, how they got to Manus Island, out of sight of New Guinea. But we do know that it wasn't until 20,000 years ago that people actually developed tools anywhere in the world that were suitable for making dugouts, for which you need an adze or a scraping device of some sort, and fire. Fire they'd already come up with hundreds of thousands of years ago, but the attendant tools to actually scrape out dugouts and figure that all out is 20,000 years ago, which may sound a little recent, but you have to remember that's twice as long ago as we domesticated cats and dogs and started harvesting crops. So this maritime enterprise stuff has been with us a very, very long time, and I think many history books need to be rewritten. The Neolithic revolution is all very good, but I think it sort of shortchanges the maritime side of things. So more obvious in sort of, we have ideas about what ships look like, and everybody knows about wooden boat and what they do, and they do some stellar, beautiful stuff, very complex joinery and things. I look at it and I can't even understand. But that's not the only way people make boats. The Inuit, who live above the tree line in North America, came up with all sorts of different types of not canvas, but skin boats, which were animal skins over very light frames. And these had several advantages, one of which is they're light, they're flexible, you can portage them easily, you can drag them over the ice without too much damage, you can run them onto rocks without too much damage, and also all of the materials you need to build them are actually right there. You can't build boats out of wood north of the tree line because there are, by definition, no trees. So you figure out what it is you have available and you make do with that. To the south, in these parts of this part of the woods, as it were, the Algonquian people and other Native Americans spreading all the way across North America to the Pacific coast and into parts of Alaska built birch bark canoes. Same general idea in terms of a very light frame, but instead of using animal skins, they used birch bark, which is a very, very tough, resilient, easily repaired, and fairly easy to make if you are talented and know how to do that kind of thing. To me, it looks about as hard as making a boat, a wooden boat. But these were people's adaptations of their environment to what they needed and what they required. And what they required was something light and easily maneuverable that also had a fairly large capacity so they could move themselves and their crops and their people and their goods around these amazing river systems of North America. And if you look at the sort of ancient map of North America, the pre-Columbian map, you look at the Mississippi system, and that's where you find the sort of most robust Native American communities and civilizations and societies and nations, or whatever you want to call them. They're found on the Ohio River, the Minnesota River, and the Mississippi River, and all through the network of tributaries that extend all the way up into the Rockies via the Missouri and its tributaries. So navigation, although it doesn't attain the same sort of importance until much later, navigation of the inland waterways was crucial to the development of societies, particularly in North America, and most obviously in North America, but also in other parts of the world. And people likewise came up with different types of vessels based on what was available to them. The most important, just another type of vessel that I'll just sort of, or material that I'll just touch on is the Mesopotamians' use of reeds, which they fashioned together to make either round boats called kufa, which they sailed on the rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, but they also made these fantastic reed boats with sails thousands of years ago, which they sailed across the Persian Gulf and probably to the Indus Valley and northern India and Pakistan. And what's remarkable about these vessels is not only were they made out of reeds and in this sort of boat-like shape with masts and sails, but to waterproof them and to preserve them, they coated these hulls with bitumen because there are natural petroleum seeps all over the Middle East. And it's not like they just sort of went and they saw, oh, look, some bitumen, I'll just smear that on my boat. They actually had to come up with the right consistency. And we have some idea of how difficult this was because there are a bunch of experimental archaeologists who've been working in Southwest Asia and building replicas of these things and really scratching their heads, even after finding examples of these bitumen slabs, trying to figure out what the composition is and how do you make it, how do you put it together, and how do you put it on so it's viscous enough to hold, but not, it doesn't just sort of leak through to the inside and doesn't fall off, and it's a very tricky business, as you can imagine. And people were doing this 4,500, 5,000 years ago at the very least. So the most important, there are a couple of technologies that I want to touch on, which I think are really seminal to the development of maritime history and to human society in general. The first is the sail, the second is the steam engine, and the third is, or the third and fourth are the tanker and the container ship. So the sail we don't know too much about the origins of the sail, except that it probably happened somewhere between Mesopotamia and Egypt. There's some evidence for it. It's pretty good from around the Persian Gulf, somewhere near Kuwait, of sails being used about 5000 BC. But the first clear depiction of a sail, the first sort of any written or visual evidence of any kind, comes from a vase found in Egypt on the Nile, or by the Nile River, at a place called Gerze. And it's the Gerzean vase, and it dates to about 3200 BC, so a little more than 5,000 years ago. And it's a vessel with a very sort of acutely upturned bow and stern and a square sail sailing on the Nile. And what's critical about this is that at that time, Egypt was divided basically between two different culture areas and two different sort of economic or technological areas. To the south, upstream, was the much richer Upper Egypt. And to the north, downstream, was Lower Egypt. And that's basically everything from Cairo north through the Delta. Around this time, the same time as the Gerzean vase, you get the sudden unification of Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And what made that possible, I submit, is that finally there was a way to go downstream on the Nile, which it had always been possible to do very easily because it's a very easy flowing stream. I think the drop is about 1 in 14,000 for the last 600 or 700 miles. Very easy current. Obviously a little worse in the spring when you have the spring floods. But going upstream, even though it's a very stately, gentle, but consistent current, it's very difficult to row or paddle. So going from north to south is problematic, except if you have a sail. And the sail is possible. What makes the sail possible, and what made the unification of Egypt possible, is that the prevailing winds on the Nile go from the Mediterranean to the south. So if you could go easily downstream, rowing or paddling, row your boat, that was one thing. But now if you had a sail and you could harness the wind, you could go sail, 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 sail upstream. And suddenly you have this unification of ancient Egypt. And this became hugely important because Egypt is one of the oldest civilizations that we know of. It's one of the most enduring. They're having some problems now, but they will weather those. They've been around the block on this a few times. I'm not terribly worried about Egypt as a place. But this was a very, very crucial development. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But before that, I want to just talk about the steamboat and the tanker and containerization. The steamboat, to go back to North America and to our country, as I said, there were canoes being plied up and down the Mississippi and the Ohio and the Missouri River and their tributaries for millennia. But essentially, even though we had taken on the Louisiana Purchase and St. Louis and Clark out basically almost entirely by water over to the Pacific, there was really no way to harness the interior of the United States without some sort of artificial means of propulsion. Because if you took a flatboat from Louisville to New Orleans, which was sort of the main New York, LA kind of route at that time, it would take about 2 to 3 weeks to go downstream on a flatboat, and about 3 or 4 months to go upstream. And the way you went most of the way upstream was hauling the flatboat with ropes and people, not animals, generally speaking. So shortly after, within a year or two after Robert Fulton developed the North River Steamboat on the Hudson and made the first commercially viable steamship, he got together with a friend of his, Nicholas Roosevelt, who built a steamboat in Pittsburgh and sailed it down to New Orleans, and boom, all of a sudden, they had cut the time southbound to 10 days from 2 to 3 weeks, and they had cut the northbound time from 3 to 4 months to 20 days. And by the middle of the 19th century, you were basically doing the downward thing and the upward thing in less than a week. So 1,300 miles in less than a week under steam all of a sudden opening up the middle of the United States, the middle of North America, was not only possible, but it was happening. And it was happening because of this huge development in technology, maritime technology, which most people generally associate with the oceans. And as important as it was for the oceans, it was much more startling and much more important for continental interiors, not only in the United States, but also South America, if you think of the Orinoco and the Amazon, Europe, the Rhine, the Danube, all of those tributaries to the Baltic and North Seas, and also, of course, in Asia. So the steam engine was really fundamental, but again, I would say that in the traditional telling, it's not so much the going back and forth across salt water as it was being able to actually maneuver efficiently on fresh water. In 1885, the next big development, I think, was the launch of the first purpose-built oil tanker. And this was actually at the behest of Nobel Prize fame's brother, who was an oil shipper on the Caspian Sea. And by some very weird quirk of history, 1885 was also the year that Carl Benz got his patent for the internal combustion engine. And it's pretty safe to say that if Carl Benz hadn't invented the internal combustion engine, there wouldn't have been that great a need for the oil tanker. And if there hadn't been oil tankers, the internal combustion engine never would have taken the place it has in 20th century society and 21st century society. The next big development after that in terms of how we ship things was containerization. And that happened in 1956, and together, between the tanker and the container ship, that really sort of made globalization happen. It really was the start of the Anthropocene age, that geological term that people now like to talk about, of when mankind really began to develop and exert influence over the environment prominently. So a third thing, which has less to do with obviously the the technology of propulsion, was the development of nylon and other synthetic fishing gear. And this is a post-World War II phenomenon, which has absolutely wrought havoc, as you all know, I'm sure, on the world's fish populations. And it's not only the nylon fishing gear, but it's the associated apparatus of sonar and radar and spotting planes and radio reports and all that sort of stuff. And I just want to read a quote from a British fisherman who was interviewed in 1972, which is, what, 40-something years ago. So 40 years ago, I mean, people sort of say, oh, we're not thinking about this enough. We haven't started, we're sort of just getting around to thinking about this. People who were actually doing the fishing 40 years ago realized just what a travesty had been wrought by this new technology. And what this man says is, up to the time of World War II, fishing was still prosecuted in the old style. There was some evolution, but the thing had not greatly altered from the days of Galilee. Really? Because the drift net was more a primitive method of fishing. You shot your nets, and you waited until the herring caught you. The result was, of course, we did not catch all the herring. We only caught some of them, and that was a good idea, because there was always some left for another year. From the end of the war, that's when the depredation took place. That's when the final killing took place. And that was 40 years ago. And things have not gotten any better since then, as you know. So the third encounter that I want to talk about, or the third interaction, is how people interact with each other and society in terms of maritime history. And there are several ways of thinking about this. One, I think, that's most fascinating to me, and people frequently ask me, what is the thing that I learned that was most astonishing in the book? And it really has very little to do with the sort of, they're always expecting me to say something about ships or ship technology. And really what it has to do with is the relationship between religion and commerce. And this is something that goes way back. We find it in the 5th century with Hinduism getting to Indonesia and Bali, which is a very curious phenomenon because today, if you talk about Hinduism, and particularly in the early modern periods, people say, well, Hindus don't go to sea. You know, they're afraid of the sea, or they don't like the sea, or they don't like trade. And you know, that's kind of true-ish, but it's not really true. Because if it were true, there would be no way that that enough Hindus would have gone to Indonesia to set up shop there and build beautiful temples on Java, and for Bali, the island of Bali, which is east of Java, to still be predominantly Hindu. The next great wave of sort of documented religion and commerce comes from the 9th century, when the Danes and the French were beginning to interact in all sorts of different ways. But the one that predominates the narrative usually is about the Vikings. And there was a Danish guy named Harold Clack. And Harold Clack wanted some help from Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son. And Louis the Pious got his name because he was very eager to proselytize and to convince other people to become Christian. And so he said, well, I will help you, Mr. Clack, if you, in fact, convert to Christianity. And Harold Clack said, well, that's not a bad idea, because, as he put it, a Christian people would more readily come to his aid and to the aid of his friends if both peoples were worshippers of the same God. So, fairly straightforward. So one of the people who pioneered this development and this expansion of Christianity in Scandinavia was a guy named Ansgar. And Ansgar became known as the Apostle of the North. And he dealt with this guy, Eric I of Denmark. And they didn't get off to a very good start because Eric burned his church in Hamburg and various places. But eventually, Ansgar prevailed upon Eric to let him build a church in a town called Hedeby. And he did that, and he found a place that was, he said, especially suitable for this purpose and was near to the district where merchants from all parts congregated. And this proved very profitable to everybody, the Frisians and the Franks and the Danes and other merchants. They went there readily and without any fear, something which was not thought possible previously. But my favorite story about the sort of relationship between religion and commerce has to do with a guy named Ismail, who was a Persian Gulf shipper who went down and sailed. He was sailing down to the coast of East Africa, and he got blown off course, and he winds up in Mozambique, probably. And he mates there, and he likes to trade there because these people are sort of out of the trade realm, and they haven't figured out that you can charge people taxes and duties and that kind of stuff, and profit just from having merchants show up at your place. So Ismail gets the stuff he needs, and it's not really enumerated, except that it's probably wood and tortoiseshell and some other things, and 200 slaves, which he mentions just as an aside. And then Ismail, being a little naive about these, I mean, the king, who's not named, it's a little naive, very young, goes on board the ship to say goodbye, and Ismail and his crew sort of go, well, you know, that's one more slave, and plus his retinue will take them all. And so they bundle them aboard ship, and they sail off to Oman, and the king is sold into slavery. He makes his way to Baghdad. He's converted to Islam. He goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca. He runs away from his master and goes to Cairo. He sees the bright lights in the big city, gets tired of that, goes up the Nile, over to the coast, makes his way back to his kingdom, and he resumes his throne. So Ismail has sort of pioneered this shipping route, sails back to his old haunts, and lo and behold, he's brought before the king. And we can imagine that this was not a very happy time for him at that moment. But the king said, look, what you did was terrible. There's no gainsaying that. But you have nothing to fear. like myself, my people have embraced the religion of Islam, and if I have forgiven you, it is because you were the first cause of the purity of my religion. And he says, so you can go. I'm not going to come by and see you off on your ship again, but you can go. And all I ask is that you let Muslims know that they may come here to us as to brothers, Muslims like themselves. So he might as well have just hung out a sign saying, Arabic spoken here, we're, ici on parle français, we're good, let's trade. And this we find again and again and again. And of course, the big religious commercial expansion, obviously, is Christianity to North and South America, to Australia, to New Zealand, all over the place. But it actually started in these smaller pockets, in these smaller regions, carried, again, by maritime commerce. Now, the story from Buzurg is really part of this collection of about 120, 130 stories, some of which read like something out of Aladdin, or Sinbad and the 1001 Nights, but it's actually earlier than that. And that's all part of a tradition, though, that comes out of one of the oldest literatures, and perhaps the oldest literature in the world, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the forerunner of Noah's Ark, and the forerunner of Odysseus, and the forerunner of Sinbad, and the forerunner of all sorts of different narrative styles and tropes that we find all the way down to the present, to Ulysses in James Joyce. So people have always been attracted to these maritime stories, and they've always sort of dealt with maritime themes in very interesting ways. And one of the things that I find fascinating about Egypt, which is, I devote an entire chapter to ancient Egypt, and it's the only country or very small region like that to which I devote a chapter at all in the book. But if you read it, you'll understand why. It's got tons of archaeologically preserved ships, it's got a fantastic literature, it's got great visuals. But one thing that I find really fascinating is that when I was growing up, I trained as a classicist in college. Not a very good one, which is why I went in to do other stuff. But I always thought that the ship of state metaphor came from Horace in the 1st century BC. And I thought, well, maybe it came from the Greek a little bit earlier than that. The ship of state metaphor comes from, does anybody know how old it is? Anybody want to take a guess? I've already told you how old it isn't. Okay, good. It's about 4,000 years old. And it comes from Egypt. And it comes from Egypt in a whole variety of different ways. One of them is this great story called The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. This peasant is walking across somebody else's land, and the landowner comes and he takes his stuff, and he won't give it back. And so the peasant goes to the king, the pharaoh's chancellor, and he says, "I want my stuff back." And the chancellor says, "Okay, I'll take your complaint up to the pharaoh." And he regales the pharaoh with the eloquent peasant's version of events. And the pharaoh is so taken with his version of events that he says, "Well, yes, he's been wrong, but string him along for a little bit because I want to see what he comes back with tomorrow." And he does this for a whole succession of meetings. And during the course of this, the peasant says things like, "I am on a voyage without a boat, Renzi. You are safe harbor for all who are drowned. Rescue one who has been shipwrecked." And he goes on and on like this, and you were the helmsman of the ship of state, obviously. And 1,000 years later, the pharaoh Hatshepsut, the only female ruler of Egypt in antiquity, is described as the bow rope of the south, the mooring stake of the southerners, the excellent stern rope of the northerners is she. And if you look at the way the people who built the pyramids were organized, they're organized in these gangs, which are like the bow quarter gang and the stern port quarter gang, and it's all this maritime metaphor. Everything, not everything, but a lot of things in Egyptian society are really focused on the way ships work and the way maritime enterprise happens, because they are very, very tied not only to the Nile, but also to the Mediterranean and to a lesser extent to what happens on the Red Sea. But In addition to the way the Egyptians organized themselves for work on land and on boats, we also have the way people organize themselves on boats in other communities. And the ones that we know about the best from the medieval period in the Mediterranean are from two sources, one Christian and one Muslim. And in Italy, we find this very interesting transition. People generally got together and worked on boats and traded by pooling their resources. It was a very democratic idea. And so you talked of a ship's company. But eventually, people said, well, you know, you don't have enough money to bring to this party. I will finance it, and you will work for me. And you'll get a lot less share of the venture, but you'll get some share of the venture. And so the success of the venture depends a little bit on your work, and you won't get that much out of it, but you know, work hard and you'll get something. I think a very Republican attitude towards how to organize business. Muslims had a completely different approach based on the Quranic teachings that people should get paid for what they did. And so the advantage of that was that whether the voyage was a success or not, the crews got paid. And you know, the disincentive, if you will, was that you know, they didn't have much of an interest in it succeeding wildly. But obviously they had some interest because if the voyage succeeded, then there would be another voyage and another voyage and another voyage. So there are these two different approaches to the organization. But in Italy, I mean, in the Christian tradition, you find this degrading of people from being members of a ship's company to being just a paid crew. And this, again, happens in the 19th century in Maine. In the 18th century, shortly after the Revolution, the government had imposed a cod bounty. And so people were paid on shares, and everybody sort of contributed something to the running of a boat. And after you know, you came back from your fishing voyage, you would divide up everything, and according to what you'd put in, you would take out. This fishing bounty was repealed just after the Civil War, and all of a sudden the dynamic of the fishing industry changed tremendously, and it all went to the moneyed interests in the southern part of the state, and people went from being paid, you know, shareholders in a voyage to being just the crew. And you know, back then there was no minimum wage even, so people were really sort of forced to work incredibly hard for very, very little return, and very little guarantee on return. The other thing, just to return to the containerization issue or subject, this had a threefold effect on the world as we know it. One was basically everything we knew about maritime industry and ports and society around maritime enterprise changed literally overnight. Between 1958 and 1980, when I got out of college, New York City, where I grew up, had transformed completely. All of the piers along the Hudson River completely abandoned. And they'd all been completely abandoned for two reasons. The containerization was one, there were no more little cargo ships coming in and dumping their cargoes. And two, all the passenger shipping had been wiped out because the jet engine, the jet plane, had started commercial service in 1956 or 57. And so people no longer went to the west side to get on passenger ships. They went to the airport to, you know, go to Kennedy or Newark or LaGuardia. But most of the shipping that left was commercial shipping. And it had all gone to waste areas that nobody wanted to inhabit and that hadn't been developed because it was just useless land. And this happened all over the world. In New York, we call that part of the world New Jersey. And I love New Jersey. You can't go to Pennsylvania without it. But in London, the same thing happened. I mean, all over the world, container ports had to be built in places that were completely removed from the core of the cities, the ports that had grown up around maritime enterprise. And maritime enterprise had brought with it all of these things, these exotic smells, exotic people, exotic sounds. If you look at Liverpool and New York in the 1960s, that's the Beatles, and the British invasion came by sea, largely, because it was in ports like Belfast, where Van Morrison first heard the blues, because there were crews just coming back and forth with their records. And this was, kids, you don't know anything about this, but these older people, they can tell you, this was how the world worked. We traded stuff, actual physical material things, and you put it on turntables and it went round and round. Very fascinating. But, so that was one thing. I mean, that really, really changed the way that the world worked. The other was that the volume of, the other thing was that the nature of dock work changed. And just to give you an idea, in Australia, the figures are staggering. It was something like, in 30 years, the dock work population of Australia fell from about 30,000 to 2,000. Because that's all, and the volume of trade has gone up, but the number of people you need to move that trade has just plummeted. The advantage to the people who actually kept their jobs was that instead of just being sporadic work that only happened when a ship happened to come into port, it became very steady work and very highly trained work and very highly paid work. Because the guys who are jiggling the container cranes are, highly skilled people, as well they should be, because their containers hold about, some of them up to $100,000 worth of stuff, and you don't want them just kind of dropping it into the drink or dropping it onto a car or a truck or a person. So they tend to be very, very good at what they do. But the other thing that happened is the volume of trade. And volume of trade, if we take the first 12 years of containerization, so 1970 as a benchmark, trade over the previous 50,000 years had gone from 0 to 2.6 billion tons a year, seaborne trade. Now it's gone up to well over 8 billion tons in the last 40 years because of globalization. But globalization is actually a function of, or a result of, to a great degree, containerization. And so if we do live in an Anthropocene age, and a consumer culture, and a globalized culture, I think we can point directly at containerization and the associated benefits and ills as being the result. And so these are the three things I wanted to talk about, and I hope they have something to do with what it is I believed I was going to talk about and what I believe it is you teach here. But thank you again very much for having me, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.